Carrie Holbrook always said the scent of fresh baked goods reminded her of happiness. That's how their story with Dexter began. He walked into her little bakery on Maple Street on a chilly October morning, drawn by the smell of cinnamon and vanilla. Back then, 7 years ago, she was a budding entrepreneur with huge ambitions and credit under her belt, and he was a hopeful realtor, charming clients with a white-toothed smile and polished success stories. Dexter showed up at the bakery every morning, ordering black coffee and an almond croissant. A month later, they were already having lunch together. 3 months later, he proposed to her at an expensive restaurant overlooking Baltimore Harbor. Carrie remembered that evening in great detail, the sparkle of the diamond in the candlelight, the taste of champagne, and the feeling of absolute, uncontaminated happiness. The first years of their marriage had seemed perfect. Dexter supported all his wife's endeavors, helped to expand the bakery, turning it into a cozy cafe with its own style and regular customers. His career was on the upswing, too, from simple agent to co-owner of the prestigious real estate agency Holbrook & Associates. They bought a Victorian house in a prestigious neighborhood, traveled to Europe every summer, and made plans for the future. Cracks began to appear imperceptibly, like thin lines on a porcelain cup. At first, it was little things. Dexter was increasingly late for work, missing their traditional Sunday brunches, forgetting anniversaries. His phone was increasingly screened down, and his conversations grew shorter and more superficial. Carrie put it down to stress. The real estate market was going through a rough patch, and Dexter was working harder than usual. It was getting quieter in their house. The lively discussions of the previous day were replaced by short phrases about the weather and plans for tomorrow. Carrie immersed herself in her work, expanding the bakery and experimenting with new recipes. Dexter increasingly slept in the city apartment he rented for business meetings, explaining that he was late showing houses and early meeting with clients. And then there was Mercedes Vale. She'd come to Dexter's agency looking for luxury real estate for a new chain of fitness studios. Tall, slender, with a mop of copper hair and the confident gait of someone used to getting what she wanted. Carrie had first seen her at a local Chamber of Commerce fundraiser. Dexter had introduced Mercedes as an important client, but something in his voice, in the way he'd said her name, had made Carrie wary. After that evening, Mercedes, whom everyone called Mercy, became a frequent guest in their social circle. She showed up at business receptions, charity auctions, even stopped by Carrie's bakery, just because I love your almond croissants. Every time Mercy was near him, Dexter seemed to come alive, his eyes lighting up with the same sparkle they'd seen in the early years of their marriage. Carrie watched these changes in silence. She noticed the change in her husband's gait when Mercy entered the room, the way his hand lingered on her shoulder a little longer than necessary when he greeted her, the way they exchanged glances when they thought no one was watching. Each evening as she closed the bakery, she lingered longer and longer, going over bills, checking supplies, rearranging jars of toppings, just to avoid returning to the house where silence awaited her. There was the faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume in their bedroom, not intrusive but distinct enough to notice. Dexter's shirts sometimes had lipstick residue on them, from the occasional hug with female clients, he explained. His credit card was mottled with bills from restaurants he never told her about. Carrie continued to remain silent. She just added more cinnamon to the dough, baked new batches of croissants, and smiled at the customers. And at night, she lay awake, listening to her husband's steady breathing and thinking that their marriage, like her favorite puff pastry, was beginning to crumble before her eyes, turning into a handful of crumbs that could never be put back together again. Spring in Baltimore has been unusually warm. The magnolia blossoms filled the air with sweet fragrance, and Carrie began to notice, for the first time in a long time, how much their once cozy home had changed. Dexter now spent no more than a few hours a day here, returning at midnight and leaving before dawn. His jacket smelled more and more of someone else's perfume, and once in his pants pocket, she'd found a check from the Harbor View Hotel, the same one where he'd once proposed to her. The Mercedes Vale Fitness Center's deal was dragging on. At least that's how Dexter explained his constant meetings with her. "She's a very demanding client, dear. You realize contracts like this don't just fall by the wayside." Carrie understood. Understood even too well, especially when she'd accidentally seen the two of them together at the Little Italy restaurant Dexter, feeding Mercy tiramisu from his spoon, and Mercy laughing, tilting her head back and showing off her flawless neck. Dexter was changing. He started going to the gym, got to keep in shape for the clients, bought a new closet, changed his perfume. His iPhone was now always locked with a new password, and in the evenings he spent long hours texting someone, smiling the same smile that had previously been reserved for Carrie. More and more business dinners and out-of-town real estate showings appeared on their shared calendar. One morning, while going through her husband's papers looking for insurance documents, Carrie came across a folder with a design project for a new fitness center. On the sketches of the interior, she noticed numerous markings in a woman's handwriting. The elegant letters were folded into tips and notes, and at the bottom of the page was a heart and the initials W. Carrie stared at it for a long time, feeling a cold emptiness growing inside. That afternoon, for the first time in a long time, she decided to have lunch not at her bakery, but at a fancy new restaurant downtown. Fate, with its sometimes cruel sense of humor, had bumped her into Mercedes there. She was sitting at a table by the window, impeccable in her cream suit, hastily typing something into her phone. Noticing Carrie, she waved hello and invited her to join her. "Carrie, darling, what a coincidence! I was just thinking of stopping by your place for those divine macaroons." Mercy spoke easily and casually, as if she wasn't the cause of her interlocutor's sleepless nights. A new Cartier bracelet glistened on her wrist, the same one Carrie had seen on her husband's recent shopping list. They talked about the weather, new restaurants, rising real estate prices. Mercy talked about her plans to expand her fitness center chain, casually mentioning how invaluable Dexter was to her. "He's just irreplaceable. Such attention to detail, such care for the clients." Her eyes misted dreamily at the mention of Dexter's name. Carrie listened, mechanically stirring the long-cooled tea, and noticed the details. Mercy's fresh manicure the same shade as the marks on Dexter's shirt collar, the light scent of the same perfume she'd smelled in their bedroom, the carelessly tossed, "and Dexter said," where the formal Mr. Holbrook had been. That evening of the same day, Dexter didn't come home for the first time that night. Didn't call, didn't text, just didn't show up. Carrie spent that night in the kitchen, methodically baking batch after batch of his favorite almond croissants. By dawn, the entire kitchen was littered with cooling baked goods, and her hands were covered in tiny burns from the hot baking trays. He returned the next morning, fragrant with fresh cologne, and embarrassed to explain that he'd fallen asleep in the office working on important documents. Carrie silently placed the coffee and a plate of croissants in front of him. Dexter grumbled, "Sorry, honey, I'm on a diet. Mercy recommended a new eating program for me." At that moment, something snapped inside Carrie completely. She watched her husband hurriedly getting ready for work, adjusting his tie, a gesture she'd once loved, checking his phone messages, and realized that this man living in their house, sleeping in their bed, was no longer the Dexter she'd loved 7 years ago. The following weeks became a strange spectacle. Dexter showed up less and less often. His suit smelled more and more of someone else's perfume. And one day, Carrie even found a key card to the Harborview Hotel in his jacket pocket. He stopped hiding his late-night meetings, simply calling them business engagements, and his phone lit up more and more with messages with the name MV on the screen. Carrie remained silent. She continued to run the bakery's business, smiling at customers, creating new recipes. But something dark and heavy was growing inside her, something that made her stare long afterward at photos of the happy times of their marriage and think about how fragile what seemed eternal was. Then one morning she saw them together. Dexter and Mercy were walking out of Harborview holding hands. They hadn't noticed her car parked across the street, didn't see her gripping the steering wheel to white knuckles. They didn't hear her silently repeating her husband's name, as if trying to get him back to his old self with a single effort of will. That day was the first time Carrie didn't open the bakery. She spent hours behind the wheel of her car, driving through the Baltimore suburbs and pondering how it had happened that her perfect life had become a shambles. And in the evening, she began to plan, slowly, methodically, with the same care she always took in creating her signature desserts. The July heat blanketed Baltimore in a sweltering heat wave. Carrie spent more and more time in the cool room of the bakery, watching passers-by through the window as they hurried to escape the scorching sun. Her life became a mechanical repetition of the same actions. Knead the dough, roll it, bake it, sell it, smile. In between these activities, she methodically collected evidence that her husband had been living another life for a long time. It all started with the accidental discovery of a second cell phone in the glove compartment of Dexter's car. She'd stopped by the car wash at his request and discovered a small black Samsung hidden under some old receipts. The phone wasn't password protected. Apparently Dexter was confident his stash was secure. The messages on it left no room for doubt. Miss you. Yesterday was magical. Can't wait for our trip. Mercy's every word was imbued with the passion that Carrie had once considered her privilege. There were pictures, too. Dozens of pictures. Dexter and Mercy on the yacht, in restaurants, in that very harbor view suite. In every one of them, her husband glowed with that special happiness that hadn't been seen in their home in a long time. Carrie methodically copied all the files to her phone, put the Samsung back where it belonged, and drove home, feeling a cold resolve growing inside. The next find was airline tickets. 2 first-class tickets to Santa Barbara, booked for the next month. Dexter hadn't even bothered to hide the printout. It lay in his home office between the business papers. Next to it was a draft contract for the purchase of a house, a luxury villa overlooking the ocean. Dexter Holbrook and Mercedes Vale were the 2 names in the buyer's column. Carrie didn't make a scene. She continued her silent hunt for evidence, gathering it like ingredients for a complex recipe. Joint credit cards, hotel reservations, jewelry store receipts. Every detail fit into the big picture of betrayal. The denouement came one sweltering August evening. Dexter came home earlier than usual, unusually serious and focused. Carrie was just sitting at the kitchen table, poring over the evidence she'd collected. "We need to talk," he began, and for the first time in a long time he looked her straight in the eye. "About what? About the villa in Santa Barbara or the Tiffany ring you bought last week?" Carrie slowly laid out printouts, photos, checks on the table. "Or maybe about how you're planning a new life behind my back." Dexter didn't deny it. He sank into the chair opposite and spoke honestly for the first time in months. "I fell in love, Carrie. I didn't plan it. I wasn't looking for it. But it happened. Mercy. She makes me alive. She makes me feel like I haven't felt in years." "And me? What have I been feeling all these months?" Her voice remained surprisingly calm. "I'm sorry. I know it sounds corny, but I'm really sorry. You're a wonderful woman, Carrie. You deserve someone who will truly love you." "How noble of you." Carrie gathered the papers into a neat stack. "And when do you plan to move out?" "I've already found an apartment. I'll get my stuff tomorrow. My lawyer will contact you about the divorce." It was resolved quickly and businesslike, like one of his real estate deals. Dexter went upstairs to gather the essentials, and Carrie stayed in the kitchen, looking out the window at the thickening dusk. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. A fine rain drizzled outside the window, turning the streets into a mirrored canvas. Carrie got behind the wheel of her old truck that she used to deliver large orders from the bakery. She knew that on Fridays, Dexter and Mercy had breakfast at a small cafe on the edge of town before heading to the office. The driveway was nearly empty. The morning fog shrouded the trees, turning them into blurry silhouettes. Carrie drove slowly, peering into the shroud of rain. She saw their car from a distance, Dexter's silver Lexus easily recognizable even in the fog. They were just leaving the cafe, holding hands and hiding under the same umbrella. Carrie pressed lightly on the gas pedal. The truck rumbled quietly, picking up speed. The rain intensified, turning the world into a blurry watercolor. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the turn signal turning on and Dexter's surprised face, noticing her a split second before the impact. And then there was silence, broken only by the sound of rain and the distant howl of sirens. Detective Ted Griswold arrived on the scene 20 minutes after the call. The drizzling rain had turned the asphalt into a shiny mirror that reflected the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances. A bakery delivery truck lay frozen in the middle of the road, its front end crumpled from the impact. A few meters ahead, a mangled silver Lexus could be seen dented into a roadside tree. "What do we have here?" Griswold turned to his partner, Detective Rebecca Price, who had already had a chance to talk to the first witnesses. "Double homicide. Looks like Dexter Holbrook, 38, realtor, and Mercedes Vale, 27, owner of a chain of fitness centers, both died at the scene. The truck was driven by Carrie Holbrook, wife of the deceased. She's conscious, with minor injuries already in the hospital. Griswold slowly walked around the scene of the accident. His trained eye immediately noted several oddities. There was no long brake track. The truck had hit the Lexus at full speed. The impact had hit the driver's side, as if the truck driver had been aiming that way. Witnesses? Griswold pulled out a notepad. 2. A barista from the cafe across the street and an elderly woman walking her dog. Both claim the truck appeared suddenly out of the fog and hit the car as it was just starting out of the parking lot. A forensics car pulled up to the scene. Griswold watched as they methodically photographed the scene, collected samples, measured distances. Something about the accident seemed wrong to him, too neat for an accidental collision. "Check the Holbrook family history," he told Price. "I want to know everything. Finances, social connections, possible conflicts. And I'm especially interested in the connection between the dead woman and Mr. Holbrook." By noon, the rain had intensified, but work at the scene continued. Forensic investigators found that the truck's braking system was fully functional. No technical faults were found that could have caused the accident. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Griswold and Price arrived at the hospital to speak with Carrie Holbrook. She was sitting in a hospital bed, pale but collected. There were only small scratches on her face from broken glass. "I was just on my way to deliver an order," she said quietly. "The fog was really thick. I didn't notice their car until it was too late." Griswold watched her carefully, noting every detail. The way she avoided a direct look, the way her fingers nervously rubbed the hospital blanket, the way her voice trembled at the mention of her husband. Back at the station, the detectives plunged into studying the materials they had collected. The story began to come together piece by piece. Dexter Holbrook had been in a romantic relationship with Mercedes Vale for the past 6 months. They were planning a future together and had bought a house in California. On the eve of the accident, Dexter informed his wife of his decision to file for divorce. "Look at this." Price placed printouts of bank statements in front of her partner. Carrie Holbrook made a large cash withdrawal from her account 2 days ago. Also, she changed her delivery route. Normally, she'd deliver orders by a different route. Griswold tapped his pencil on the desk thoughtfully. "Check the surveillance tapes from that street for the last week. I want to know if Mrs. Holbrook did any reconnaissance of the area there." By late afternoon, new details had emerged. Cameras showed that Carrie's truck had passed the cafe 3 times at the same time during the week before the accident. Photos of her husband and his mistress were found on her phone, taken secretly. And in the house, they found a neatly assembled folder of evidence of the affair. Receipts, printouts of messages, photos. "She's been preparing," Price said quietly, looking through the materials. "All this time, she's been collecting evidence and watching it." Griswold nodded. "And picked the perfect spot. Narrow road, frequent fog in the morning, minimal witnesses. If it weren't for the braking distance, or rather, lack thereof." The technical expert confirmed their suspicions. There were no signs of attempted braking. The truck was moving in a straight trajectory, aimed precisely at the driver's door of the Lexus. The next day, they visited Carrie again at the hospital. She still insisted on her version of the story. Accident, poor visibility, fatal coincidence. But now the detectives were noticing more. How she remembered details too detailed for someone who supposedly hadn't seen another car in the fog. How her expression changed at the mention of Mercedes Vale. "You know what's most interesting?" Griswold said, getting back in the car after the visit. "She never once asked about her husband's condition. That's usually the first thing one asks in these situations, even if they know the answer." Price nodded, making notes in her notebook. "One more detail. They found fresh baked goods in the truck. She was actually planning a delivery that morning. Was creating an alibi for herself." "Clever. Very clever," Griswold muttered, but not enough. They spent a few more days gathering evidence. Interviewed all the bakery employees, customers, neighbors. The story was becoming clearer and clearer. A model wife, a successful business, a perfect marriage, and the betrayal that had ruined it all. And then came the final detail. A surveillance tape from a neighboring building that technicians were finally able to recover. It showed the truck emerging from the fog, and a second before the impact, the driver slightly adjusts his trajectory, aligning the truck for a precise impact. The Baltimore Police Department was buzzing like a beehive. Detectives Griswold and Price locked themselves in a conference room where the walls were hung with photos from the scene, timelines, and diagrams of the relationships of everyone involved in the tragedy. At center stage was the recovered CCTV footage, the key piece of evidence in the case. "Look at this again," Griswold scrolled through the video frame by frame. Seconds before impact, she turns the steering wheel. Not out of fright, not trying to avoid a collision. She adjusts her trajectory to hit the driver's door exactly. Price stood at the whiteboard where all the data on Carrie Holbrook had been compiled. Successful businesswoman, impeccable reputation, no conflicts with the law. The perfect wife, supporting her husband in every endeavor. Until that day. "We got the results of the forensics on her computer." Price put a new folder on the desk. For the past 3 months, she's been methodically studying the travel patterns of her husband and Mercedes Vale, charting their meetings, noting patterns, browser searches on the force of the truck's impact at different speeds, statistics on fatal accidents in low visibility. She planned everything down to the smallest detail. Griswold nodded. Picked the perfect place and time. Knew they'd be there every Friday. Even prepared real orders so she'd have a reason to be in that neighborhood. On the desk was a folder with a psychological profile of Carrie, compiled by a specialist. Highly organized personality with strong self-control. A perfectionist, used to being in control. Her husband's betrayal wasn't just a personal tragedy. It shattered her picture of a world where everything had to be perfect. Price walked over to the window, looking out at the drizzling rain, just like the day of the tragedy. "You know what strikes me most? Her calmness. She didn't snap. Didn't throw a tantrum when she found out about the affair. She just started planning." "That's what makes her truly dangerous," Griswold replied. "The cold-bloodedness, methodicality, the ability to think through every detail and still maintain complete composure." At that moment, a young officer peered into the room. "Detectives, Mrs. Holbrook is here. Says she wants to make a statement." Carrie sat in the interview room, still as collected and elegant, despite her simple hospital garb. A cup of untouched coffee stood in front of her. "I know what you found," she began before the detectives could ask a question. "The camera footage, my internet searches, the surveillance routes. You did a great job." She spoke calmly, almost with professional admiration, as if she were evaluating a well-executed order at her bakery. "You know, I've always prided myself on my attention to detail. In baking, it's essential. Exact proportions, calibrated temperature, perfect timing. Everything has to be flawless." She looked down at her hands, still bearing the burn marks from the night Dexter had announced he was leaving. "When I found out about their affair, my first inclination was to create a scandal, to break something, to scream. But then I realized that would have been too sloppy, unworthy. I'm used to doing things right." Griswold listened in silence as she described how she planned every detail. How she'd chosen the location, calculated the time, studied the weather conditions, how she practiced driving this route, memorizing every turn, every bump in the road. "That morning I baked his favorite croissants, freshly baked, exactly according to the recipe. Funny, isn't it? Even when I was preparing to kill him, I couldn't afford to do something substandard." "Why did you decide to come clean now?" Price asked. Carrie smiled, the same smile she used to greet customers in her bakery. "Because everything has to be completed properly. I never leave things unfinished." She pulled a neatly folded piece of paper from her purse, a full confession, typed and signed. "Here, I've prepared it. All the details, all the motives. I know how important accuracy is in such matters." Griswold stared at this woman, who had planned and executed the double murder with the same care with which she created her desserts, and now confessed to it just as methodically. "You know what the worst part is?" she said, rising. "I still love him, and that's why everything had to be perfect, even his death." As she was being led away, she stopped in the doorway. "Detective Griswold, I just have one request. There are some unfinished orders left at the bakery. I'd like someone to take care of them. Customers shouldn't have to suffer because of my personal problems." That evening, Griswold sat at his desk, finishing his report. Carrie Holbrook's story was finished, as perfectly calibrated as the recipes in her bakery. The crime, the investigation, the confession, It all came together in a flawless composition. "You know what the creepiest part is?" he told Price. "She controlled every detail until the last moment. Even her own confession was part of her plan." Outside the window, the rain was starting to fall again, reminding them of that morning when the perfect life turned into the perfect crime. A year after the tragedy, the bakery on Maple Street had new owners, but the locals still called it Carrie's Bakery. The windows were no longer decorated with exquisite cakes and airy croissants, and the aroma of freshly baked goods was different. More simple, ordinary. Detective Griswold sometimes drove by, remembering a case that had become one of the most unusual of his career. In the evenings, he would reread Carrie's confession, 10 pages of impeccably structured text that spelled out every detail of the crime, with the same precision with which she had once written down her recipes. Carrie Holbrook received 25 years without parole. In prison, she began working in the kitchen, and guards said that prison baked goods had never been so excellent. She still maintained her standards of excellence, even when cooking with the simplest of ingredients. The Holbrook house on a quiet street in suburban Baltimore was sold at auction. The new owners completely remodeled the kitchen, as if trying to erase the memory of a woman who turned her pain into a perfectly planned crime. The Santa Barbara mansion bought by Dexter and Mercy remained empty, a silent monument to unfulfilled dreams and ruined plans. Realtors told prospective buyers that the house was being sold at a discount because of its sad history, but never went into detail. Detective Price kept in her desk a clipping from the local newspaper with the headline, "The Perfect Crime of Passion." The article ended with a quote from Carrie's last words at the trial. "Love, like baking, requires absolute devotion to a recipe. When someone changes ingredients without warning, the result can be fatal." In the Baltimore Police Department archives, case number 20 through 34 took its place among other folders labeled closed. But sometimes, on rainy days like that fateful morning, Detectives Griswold and Price remembered the woman who approached the murder with the same care with which she created her culinary masterpieces. And in a maximum security cell at the Maryland State Prison for Women, Carrie Holbrook woke up at 5:30 every morning, as she had done all her life. As she prepared to work in the prison kitchen, she still stuck to her guiding principle. Everything had to be perfect, even if it was just a simple prison breakfast. It is said that when asked about remorse, she only smiled that very professional smile and replied, "In some recipes, you can't fix anything after baking. The only thing left to do is to start over."